She was carrying a clarinet case. That's what her classmates remembered most. They watched her step down off the school bus just like any other Friday afternoon, her book bag on her back, the hard black instrument case in her hand, a wave goodbye from the window. The bus pulled away, and 12-year-old Jennifer Renee Odom began the short walk home. 200 yards. That's all there was between the bus stop and her front door. 200 yards through a quiet rural stretch of Pasco County, Florida, where the roads were unpaved and the trees were dense, and the neighbors all knew each other by first name. She never made it. What happened on that road on February 19, 1993, would shake a community to its core and haunt the Tampa Bay area for the next 3 decades. It would launch one of the longest, most agonizing cold case investigations in Florida history. And it would take 30 years, a DNA match, and a terrifying pattern of violence before anyone could finally say her killer's name out loud. That name was Jeffrey Norman Crum. Pasco County, Florida in 1993 was the kind of place where parents still felt safe letting their kids ride the school bus alone. It was rural, quiet, the kind of small-town community where people left their front doors unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. Nobody thought twice about a girl walking 200 yards from the bus stop to her house. Nobody thought they needed to. Jennifer Odom was born on August 25, 1980, the daughter of a working-class Florida family. By the time she was 12, she was described by those who knew her as a water skier and a good all-around kid. She had friends. She had a younger sister. She had a life full of ordinary, beautiful things: afternoons on the lake, music practice, the easy rhythms of a childhood that should have been long and full. On February 19, 1993, she stepped off the school bus in the afternoon, just as she had done hundreds of times before. Her classmates remembered seeing a vehicle, a full-sized, faded blue pickup truck, moving slowly along the road behind her, traveling at a crawl, following. 2 students on the bus noticed it pull up alongside Jennifer moments after the bus departed. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. When Jennifer didn't arrive home, her family immediately began searching. Her parents called friends, neighbors, anyone they could reach. By nightfall, the alarm had spread. By the next morning, law enforcement had launched a massive search operation across both Pasco and Hernando counties. Volunteers combed fields and tree lines. Deputies knocked on doors. The story spread across local news broadcasts, then regional ones. For 6 agonizing days, Jennifer's family waited. They waited for news that would bring her home. They waited for a phone call, a sighting, anything. And the community around them held its breath alongside them, because in a place like Pasco County, where everyone knows the names on the mailboxes, the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl with a clarinet case felt like a wound to the whole neighborhood. Then, on February 25, 1993, 6 days after Jennifer vanished, a body was found. It was discovered along a horse trail cutting through an abandoned orange grove in Hernando County, just across the county line from where she was last seen. The grove was quiet and isolated, the kind of place no one would stumble upon by accident. Jennifer Renee Odom had been killed by a blow to the head. The evidence at the scene showed she had been brutally attacked. Hernando County Sheriff Al Ninhues would later describe what was done to her as vicious, brutal in every sense of the word. She was 12 years old. In the immediate aftermath of Jennifer's murder, investigators had almost nothing to go on. The 2 classmates who'd spotted the blue pickup provided the most concrete lead, and a massive manhunt began for that vehicle. But full-size blue pickup trucks were not rare in rural Pasco County in 1993. There were hundreds of them, without a plate number, without a driver's description, without anything more than the general shape of the vehicle. Investigators had little to work with. The case generated enormous community attention. Tips flooded in. Detectives worked the leads one by one, crossing them off the list with growing frustration. The case appeared on television. It was featured on programs designed to generate public tips. The Hernando County Sheriff's Office listed Jennifer's case as one of its most actively pursued cold cases, and year after year, the detectives assigned to it refused to put it in a box and forget it. Nearly 2 years after Jennifer's murder, in late 1994 or early 1995, a couple made a discovery along a rural road more than 10 miles from where her body had been found. There was a book bag, and inside a hard black case, disassembled as if someone had carefully taken it apart, was a clarinet, Jennifer's clarinet. Her belongings had been discarded along a back road in western Hernando County, far from the orange grove, far from the bus stop, far from everything. The discovery of those items was both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. It told investigators something about the person they were looking for. This wasn't impulsive chaos. Whoever had taken Jennifer had held onto her belongings, had apparently handled the clarinet with enough care or cold calculation to disassemble it, and had then driven out to a remote area to dispose of the evidence. This was a person who had thought about what they were doing. Investigators processed everything they could from those items. A fingerprint was found on a piece of notebook paper inside the book bag. It was matched to one of Jennifer's classmates, an innocent connection. The clarinet was processed for DNA evidence. Year after year, as forensic technology advanced, investigators had old evidence retested with new methods. They were searching for that glimmer of hope, as Sheriff Neenhuis would later describe it, that one piece of evidence that would give them something solid. For more than 20 years, that glimmer never came. But the detectives on this case never let go. To understand how Jeffrey Norman Crum was finally linked to Jennifer Odom, you have to go back 1 year earlier, to January 16, 1992, just 13 months before Jennifer's murder. Another young person, a 17-year-old girl, had gotten off a school bus in Pasco County. She was making her way home through the same kind of quiet, rural neighborhood roads. A man approached her. What followed was something that law enforcement described as horrific and evil. The teenage girl was abducted, beaten with devastating force and sawed. She sustained skull fractures. She had severe lacerations to her face and head. She was left for dead. But she survived. That survival would become one of the most consequential moments in this entire story, though no one would know it for decades. In the immediate aftermath of the 1992 attack, investigators processed the crime scene and gathered DNA evidence from the victim. They had a full genetic profile of the perpetrator. They ran it through CODIS, the national DNA database that law enforcement agencies use to match unknown profiles to known offenders. The search came back empty. Whoever had committed this crime was not in the database. The case went cold alongside Jennifer's. Both of them filed away in the unsolved stack at the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. Both of them never forgotten but maddeningly out of reach. The surviving victim was left to carry the weight of what happened to her. She had suffered brain damage from the severity of the attack. Her life had been permanently altered, and the man who did it walked free. Jeffrey Norman Crum was born on August 18, 1961, in Northeast Ohio. By the time he landed in Florida, he had already accumulated a history that should have put any reasonable person on high alert. He had convictions for armed robbery, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and domestic battery. He had served time in prison in Hillsborough County, Florida, for a rape conviction in the late 1980s, spending a little over 2 years locked up before his release. People who knew him in the early 1990s described a man who was volatile, dangerous, and haunted by something dark that he wore like a second skin. His father later told investigators that Crum had struggled with alcohol since he was 18, consuming as much as a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey a day. His brother told detectives that after Crum got out of prison in the late 1980s, he came back wild and crazy. That whatever had happened inside those prison walls, or to him over the course of his life, had stripped away something essential. But it wasn't just alcohol. People in Crum's orbit also described a serious crack cocaine habit and a personality that became menacing and unpredictable when he was using. He could be charming in brief flashes. And then the other version of him would surface, the one that liked to tell stories. Crum lived in northern Pasco County in the early 1990s with his father, brother, and son at a property on Somerset Acres Lane, an unpaved, wooded street off US 41. The address placed him just over a mile south of where the 1992 rape occurred. He worked construction jobs, tree trimming, drywall installation work. He told people he'd helped build Epcot and Animal Kingdom in Orlando. He drove a 1978 Toyota pickup truck. It was blue. A faded blue truck, exactly like the one Jennifer Odom's classmates saw pulling up beside her at the bus stop. What makes the story of Jeffrey Crum so deeply disturbing is not just what he allegedly did. It is what the people around him knew, or at least strongly suspected, for years and years, and largely said nothing about. According to court records released by the Tampa Bay Times in 2025, nearly 400 pages of investigative documents compiled over years of detective work. Crum apparently had a habit of boasting about his crimes. Not whispered confessions, actual bragging. He talked about Jennifer Odom the way someone might tell a story they were proud of. One woman, Susan Guntor Casiglia, had dated Crum's son for several years in the early 2000s. She told detectives about a night involving alcohol and a conversation about what it meant to be tough. She recounted how Crum had bragged about picking up a 12-year-old girl at a bus stop, telling her he'd lured the child into his truck by claiming something was wrong with her parents. Once inside, she said Crum described slamming the girl's head against the dashboard. He said he kept her for a couple of days in a shack in the woods. Then he raped her and killed her. Casiglia's own daughter, Crystal Guntor, remembered a night featuring Cisco wine and natural ice beer and talk about the baddest thing anyone had done. In her account, Crum's son turned to his father and said, "I ain't got nothing compared to what you did. You killed that girl." His father told his son he wasn't supposed to talk about that. Casiglia's son Travis was even more direct when he eventually spoke to investigators. "Everybody that knew us and knew Jeff knew that this happened," he told detectives. "This wasn't hidden." A woman named Toni Ann Buckner met Crum in the late 1990s when he was living in the backyard of her mother's home in northwest Hillsborough County. When he drank, she told investigators, he'd start talking. He'd talk about robbing banks. He'd talk about rapping women. He'd talk about killing people and burying them in the woods. And he'd talk about Jennifer Odom, about picking her up at the bus stop, taking her to the woods, rapping her and killing her. Even Crum's own family carried pieces of this knowledge. His brother reportedly once called in a tip to law enforcement, though the records are unclear about what exactly was said or how it was followed up. His nephew, TJ Seams, told investigators he remembered living next door to his uncle as a teenager. He recalled when a young girl went missing and immediately wondered about his uncle. He knew Crum could be violent. He had once held a shotgun to Seams' own head. And then there was the most chilling witness of all. Somewhere in the records, investigators found a woman who said that in June 1993, just a few months after Jennifer's murder, a man had abducted and raped her. During the assault, he spoke to her about what he'd done before. He told her about Jennifer Odom. He told her he'd brought the little girl to the same isolated spot in Hernando County, the Orange Grove. He told her about the murder with a degree of casual detail that could only come from someone who had been there. He also seemed to express something like regret. "I guess he hit her too hard or something, and he didn't mean to kill her," the woman later recalled him saying. That woman eventually managed to escape. She reported the rape. She described her attacker as short, with long dark hair and a beard. But when shown a photo lineup in 2015, she didn't pick Crum's image. He was never charged with her rape. These stories, these confessions spoken into the smoky air of a backyard fire pit or a garage late at night, they didn't reach detectives soon enough. And so Crum continued. In 2015, The world of forensic genealogy was quietly transforming what was possible in cold case investigations. Investigators working the 1992 Pasco County rape case decided to submit their original DNA evidence from the surviving victim's case into an updated search. What came back this time was not an exact match, but it was something, a familial match. The profile in the database belonged to one of Jeffrey Norman Crum's sons, who had been convicted of an unrelated offense and whose DNA had been entered into CODIS. That partial match pointed directly at the family line. Investigators quickly homed in on Jeffrey Norman Crum Sr. The circumstantial evidence began stacking up fast. He had lived in Pasco County. He matched the general description. He had a violent history, and he had driven a blue truck. In April 2015, Crum was arrested and charged with attempted felony murder, an SA in the January 1992 attack. Hernando County Sheriff's investigators, who had been quietly working Jennifer Odom's case in parallel, were watching closely. Crum was tried in April 2019 and found guilty of SA and attempted murder in the 1992 case. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in Florida State Prison. And with that conviction secured, the Hernando County investigators got to work in earnest. Over the years following Crum's 2015 arrest, detectives built a meticulous, painstaking case around Jennifer Odom's murder. The investigation described in the court records released in 2025 reads like a portrait of law enforcement at its most determined. Detective George Lloydgren of the Hernando County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit spent weeks trying to track down Crum's blue Toyota pickup. The truck had passed through several owners after Crum sold it, likely sometime in 1993, the same year Jennifer was killed. Crum's son remembered his father painting the truck gray and replacing the wooden bed. Lloydgren traced the truck's trail through vehicle records, following it through each subsequent owner until it disappeared into a scrapyard in 1997. It had almost certainly been crushed. Investigators returned to the Somerset Acres property where Crum had lived with his family in the early 1990s. The current owners gave them full access. Detectives pulled up floorboards. They processed a shipping container and a shed where Crum used to spend time. They dug up an old fire pit. They collected hair samples, fibers, dirt, and debris. They compared soil samples from the bottoms of Jennifer's feet and hair recovered from her body to everything they found. They processed the recovered clarinet for DNA. If forensic links existed, they weren't surfacing. But the witness trail was growing. The conversations Crum had carelessly scattered across decades were beginning to coalesce into a damning record. Detectives also interrogated men who had been housed near Crum in jail while he awaited trial for the 1992 case. One jailhouse informant told investigators that Crum had spoken about rapping a girl and hitting her with a large, heavy club. The same informant said Crum had admitted grabbing a girl from her bus stop. After Crum's 2019 conviction, detectives arranged something more deliberate. The jailhouse informant, by that point serving a life sentence of his own, agreed to be fitted with a hidden audio recorder and placed with Crum in a jail cell at Pasco County. Over the course of more than 4 hours of recorded conversation, Crum spoke about the rape case, his impending life sentence, and Hernando County's ongoing interest in him for a cold case. At one point he mentioned he had 2 murders and chuckled. But recorded laughter and vague comments weren't enough for a murder indictment. Investigators knew they needed more. In early summer 2023, Hernando County detectives drove to Okaloosa Correctional Institution, where Crum was being held, and requested to speak with him directly. He agreed. For 5 hours, Detective Lloydgren and his colleagues sat across a conference room table from the man they believed had killed Jennifer Odom. Lloydgren placed a small photograph of Jennifer on the table in front of Crum. Crum said he knew who she was. He said nothing else. He said he was pretty sure he had been in Orlando when she went missing. Investigators tried everything. They suggested that the old Jeff, the drunk, violent version from years ago, was the one responsible, not the man sitting across from them now. They framed the conversation as a path toward understanding, toward some kind of peace. Crum said no. When asked if he would tell them who was responsible if he knew, he said he wouldn't answer the question. When they asked if it was possible the murder was something he'd blocked from memory in a drunken blackout, Crum paused, and then he said, yes. That was the closest thing to a confession they got from him directly. On July 22, 2023, a Hernando County grand jury heard the evidence gathered over years of investigation. They reviewed the witness accounts, the DNA from the 1992 case and its connection to Crum, the striking similarities in methodology between that attack and Jennifer's murder, the confessions Crum had allegedly made to multiple people across multiple decades, and the totality of what investigators had assembled. On July 24, 2023, 30 years, 5 months, and 5 days after Jennifer Odom stepped off that bus, the grand jury returned an indictment. Jeffrey Norman Crum, then 61 years old, was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of SA in the death of Jennifer Renee Odom. Hernando County Sheriff Al Ninhues announced the arrest at a press conference on July 27, 2023. He described the parallels between the 1992 case and Jennifer's case as almost identical: the school bus, the rural Pasco County road, the blue truck, the method of abduction. He quickly, almost instantaneously became our #1 suspect in the Jennifer Odom case, the sheriff said. State Attorney Bill Gladson announced that prosecutors would seek the death penalty. Crum was transferred to the Hernando County Jail and held on no bond. He was already serving 2 life sentences, and now he faced the possibility of execution. He pleaded not guilty. To understand this case fully, you need to sit with the picture of Jeffrey Crum that emerged from the investigation, not as a monster abstracted by headlines, but as a specific, knowable kind of danger. He was short and thin, with dark hair and a beard in the early 1990s. He was originally from Northeast Ohio and had drifted south to Florida over the years, picking up construction and drywall work, living in different houses and rented rooms across Hillsborough, Pasco, and Hernando counties. He told people he'd worked on famous projects, Epcot, Animal Kingdom, and there may have been truth to some of it. He was the kind of person who could hold a conversation, could charm when he wanted to. But those who lived close to him knew something darker. His own father admitted that Crum had been troubled for decades. His brother said he was never the same after his late 1980's prison stint. His nephew remembered being taken to Ku Klux Klan meetings as a teenager and watching his uncle entertain people around a fire pit with stories of violence. Crum threatened people with firearms, including members of his own family. He had multiple convictions predating the 1992 attack: armed robbery, SA, aggravated assault, domestic battery. Florida's prison system had processed him, released him, and processed him again. Each time he came out, the pattern accelerated. His son Jeffrey Crum Jr. gave perhaps the most haunting account of all. He remembered a conversation in a garage in rural Odessa in northeast Hillsborough County, maybe a dozen years after Jennifer's murder. The two of them were drinking and smoking. His father began talking about all the bad things he'd done and all the people he'd hurt. He said he saw demons. Then he mentioned a girl. "Remember that little black girl when you were a kid?" "I did that," the elder Crum said, apparently referencing the Pasco rape survivor. And then he confessed that he had also done Jennifer Odom, then caught himself and said he was kidding. His son knew he wasn't kidding. For Jennifer Odom's family, the decades that passed between her murder and Crum's indictment represent a kind of grief that most people are never forced to endure. It is one thing to lose a child. It is another to lose a child to violence, with no answers, no accountability, no face to attach to the horror, for 30 years. Jennifer's family stayed largely quiet in the years following her death, rarely making public statements. They waited. They held on to hope. They trusted that somewhere, investigators were still working. When Crum's name surfaced in the media as a person of interest following his 2015 arrest in the 1992 case, the family continued to wait quietly. Then came July 27, 2023, and the press conference, and the announcement that there was now an indicted suspect. Jennifer's younger sister, who had become a registered nurse, had her own encounter with Jeffrey Crum that she revealed to investigators after his indictment. At some point after Crum's arrest in the 1992 case, but before his formal charge in Jennifer's murder, she had been working a shift at a Pasco County hospital when a patient requested her by name specifically. She went to the room. It was Crum. He lay in the bed under law enforcement guard. She told her supervisor she could not treat this patient, and she left. The case against Jeffrey Crum represents something investigators and criminologists recognize in a subset of violent offenders. Not the dramatic, sensationalized image of a serial killer who announces himself, but the quiet, community-embedded predator whose crimes remain hidden in plain sight for years because the systems around him fail to connect the dots. Crum's 1992 rape and attempted murder of the Pasco County teenager shares so many specifics with Jennifer's case that Sheriff Neenhuey said publicly the method of operation was almost identical. Both victims were young women getting off school buses in rural Pasco County. Both were targeted at or near the bus stop. Both were attacked with severe blunt force. The key difference was survival. The 1992 victim lived, barely, with permanent injuries. Jennifer did not survive. And then there are the later allegations. The woman who told investigators she was abducted and raped by a man in June 1993, just months after Jennifer's murder, who then spoke casually about having killed a child. If that account is accurate, it suggests that within months of murdering Jennifer Odom, the same man was assaulting again. Detectives who reviewed Pasco County's unsolved rape cases from the 1990s while building their case found troubling patterns, and investigators announced after Crum's indictment that they suspected he may have committed additional crimes. They publicly asked anyone who recognized Crum from the 1980s or 1990s to contact law enforcement. The Florida Sheriff's Association Cold Case Advisory Commission credited their assistance with providing critical support to the investigation, including specialist forensic resources that contributed to the DNA advancements that made the case possible. The case became something of a model for what cold case units can accomplish when they combine traditional investigative work, witness interviews, environmental evidence, surveillance of suspects, with modern forensic genealogy. The breakthrough in both the 1992 case and ultimately the Jennifer Odom case came from a revolution in forensic science that quietly transformed law enforcement's ability to identify suspects without a direct DNA match in CODIS. Traditional DNA matching requires an exact hit. The suspect's own profile has to already be in the national database. For decades, the perpetrator of the 1992 Pasco rape didn't exist in that database, even though investigators had a complete DNA profile from the crime scene. What changed in 2015 was the ability to search for partial, familial matches, genetic connections that point not to the suspect directly, but to a relative. When Crum's son's DNA entered CODIS through an unrelated conviction, the partial match flagged the family line. Investigators then used that lead to identify Jeffrey Norman Crum Sr. as a candidate, confirmed his profile against the 1992 crime scene evidence, and got the exact match they needed. From there, the Hernando County Sheriff's team applied the same logic to Jennifer Odom's case. Crum's DNA profile, now confirmed from the 1992 case, was compared to any biological evidence recovered in connection with Jennifer's murder. The similarities in method, geography, and timing had already made him the prime suspect. The forensic and witness evidence built the case that ultimately went before the grand jury. The use of familial DNA in this context, what some call genetic genealogy applied to law enforcement, has generated significant legal and ethical discussion across the country. Florida, like many states, has grappled with how and when this technique should be used. Critics raise concerns about privacy and the potential for investigative overreach. Supporters point to cases exactly like Jennifer Odom's, 30-year-old murders solved because of a partial match in a database, as proof of the technique's irreplaceable value. In Jennifer's case, most people would find it very hard to argue against. As of February 2026, Jeffrey Norman Crum learned in court that he would stand trial in August 2026 for the 1993 rape and murder of Jennifer Odom. At that point, he is 64 years old. He has been incarcerated continuously since his 2015 arrest in the 1992 case. He is serving 2 life sentences and has pleaded not guilty to the charges in Jennifer's murder. Prosecutors have stated their intention to seek the death penalty. The trial, when it proceeds, will likely hinge on the weight of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. There appears to be no surviving physical forensic link directly connecting Crum's DNA to Jennifer's body or her recovered belongings. The blue Toyota truck was destroyed in a scrapyard in 1997, and decades of environmental exposure compromised what little evidence remained at the sites investigators searched. The clarinet yielded no usable profile from Crum. What prosecutors have is something different and, in some ways, more damning. A long human record of a man who bragged about what he did to a little girl, who told the story to people he drank with, to people he wanted to impress, to people he considered beneath his notice. A man who described the spot in the orange grove, who described the lure he'd used, who, when finally faced by investigators across a table with a small photograph of a 12-year-old girl, could not deny knowing her. The records released by the Tampa Bay Times in 2025, all nearly 400 pages of them, paint a portrait of an investigation that was never fully abandoned, and of a community of people around Crum who carried pieces of a terrible secret for too long. There is a detail from the case file that sits with you longer than almost anything else. When Crum's son, Jeffrey Jr., was a boy around 11 years old, his father gave him what he described as a flute. It was black. It came apart and fit inside a dark carrying case. He tried playing it a few times and lost interest. Eventually he moved, and he never saw it again. It is unclear, investigators noted carefully in the records, whether that instrument might have been Jennifer Odom's clarinet. Jennifer had stepped off that bus with her clarinet case in hand. It was one of the last things her classmates remembered seeing, a girl carrying her instrument, heading home, waving goodbye. That clarinet was found disassembled along a back road in Hernando County almost 2 years later, discarded like it meant nothing. And somewhere in the years between Jennifer's murder and its discovery, there is the possibility that a little boy practiced a few clumsy notes on it without ever knowing what it was or what it had cost. That detail captures something essential about the way violent crimes ripple outward through families, through communities, through decades. Jennifer Odom's death was not contained to a single terrible moment in February 1993. It spread. It spread into the 30 years her family waited for an answer. It spread into the life of the 1992 survivor who had to carry what happened to her without ever seeing justice for most of her adult life. It spread into the community of people who knew things about Jeffrey Crum and said nothing, for whatever reasons they had. And it spread into a young boy who was handed an instrument he didn't know was the last earthly possession of a murdered child. Jennifer Renee Odom was born on August 25, 1980. She would have turned 43 on the same day that investigators announced they had finally charged someone with her murder. She deserved better. She deserved the 200 yards between the bus stop and her front door. She deserved to go home,